In this video, I'll demonstrate how to mix different shades of pink, and I'm going to do that by mixing pinks from different photographs. I have like a light warm pink in this photograph of a wall with plants in front of it. I'll do a cool pink from this rose, and then I'll try and match a hot pink from this photograph of sunglasses. I'm also going to show you what fluorescent pink looks like under a black light and talk about fluorescent paints a little bit. Finally, I'll cover some of the pigments that are recommended for mixing pink and why the same color from different brands can look different from each other. So the colors I have are quinacridone magenta, pyrrole red, and I switched over to benzimidazoline yellow instead of Hansa yellow opaque because Golden is discontinuing Hansa yellow opaque. And that's just because it's not light fast, which means it could possibly fade over time. So they're replacing it with benzimidazoline yellow. You can call it Benz yellow for short because that's quite a mouthful. And the other colors I have here are phthalo blue green shade, ultramarine blue, and titanium white. So the logical thing to do would be to mix red and white together and see what we get. Mixing a warm pink like this is pretty straightforward because red and white make a fairly good warm pink. The trouble you have is that if you need to make it duller, it's not always clear what you need to add to it to do that. So we'll see how this goes. I'm just adding more white to it to lighten it up. It looks like it needs to go duller or less saturated. So this might be where you get confused is like, what do you add to make this pink less saturated? You might think black would do it. That might work, but I really don't use black in my palette because I can mix black myself, and there's other ways to neutralize colors rather than using black. And black might not even get you there. In this case, I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine blue and see what that does. So here's a little bit of ultramarine, and I'll test it off to the side here just to see what this does. You can see that looks darker and like less saturated. That might be a little bit too much. I also have to lighten this, so I'll lighten that up. It's not bad. I think a touch of yellow. I might have went too blue on there, and that's why I put this to the side. I could just add some more of this back in here. I just add it back in there so that it sort of dilutes the blue. There's not as much in there. It's looking fairly close. I could paint some out on a swatch and see what it looks like. It's pretty close. I think maybe a little bit more white. Now, if you're doing a painting, it doesn't have to be that accurate. Who would know if this was off by a hair? So I'd say that looks pretty good. So red worked okay for mixing a warm pink, but if you need a cool pink like the pink of a rose, red won't get you there. You have to use magenta to mix pink, and I'll show you how that works. This is a photograph of a rose that I got from Pexels, and if I take this pink that we mixed from red and compare it to this rose, you can see it's too orangey. Now you might think that you could fix that by adding like ultramarine blue to it, but when I do that, it makes it a lot duller. Like it doesn't match that pink at all. It's not as vivid. This is quinacridone magenta and titanium white. You can see that's completely different than the pink that you mix from red. It's a lot cooler. You would never be able to get that red to look like this. You can see that's almost a match already. I need to put out more white. I think I added too much white, so I'll just put a dash of this magenta back in there. Okay, that's looking closer. Maybe a little bit more. I'll tweak it when I add it to the paper. So when I paint something like this, I might mix 3 or 4 pinks as like a starting point where this would be pretty good for these petals. I would mix a darker pink for the shadow areas, and then anything in between there you would just sort of like blend as you go. So I don't really go and like mix perfectly 100 different samples from this photograph. That would take too long. Let's see what that looks like. It's not too bad, but it's the same problem as the other one where it needs a little bit of ultramarine, I think. See what that does. It looks pretty good. I think it needs a touch of yellow. It's kind of like the edge of this rose is a little bit cooler and it gets more warm as you go here, but I think that's a pretty good match of that edge of that petal. You might be wondering why you can't mix this pink from red, and the theory behind that is that red really isn't a primary color. The actual primary colors are cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. That's what they use in the printing industry. If you look at any magazine, all the reds in there are made from printing magenta over the top of yellow. So you can also do that with paints. I know there's books out there that say that doesn't apply to paints, but I've demonstrated this before, and I'll give you a quick demo in this video too. So here's Benz yellow. Actually, I'll just use the palette knife so I can mix up more paint. So this is quinacridone magenta and the Benz yellow. The majority of it is magenta with a little bit of Benz yellow in there. That makes a fairly decent red. It's not quite as saturated as the pyrrole red, but when you thin it out, it looks a little bit more saturated too. So I mean, it's not too far off. This is definitely more opaque and it's slightly more saturated, but you get the idea that makes a reddish color. You can mix orange from it too by adding more yellow. So this is the main explanation is why you can't get to a pink like this from red. If you think about this, I can add white to it to make a pink, but you have a similar problem as you do with the Pyrrole red, is that it's a warm pink. So the combination of magenta and yellow makes a warm pink, just like the red. So why not just leave out the yellow and use magenta by itself, which leads to this pink? So that should make sense to you. I mean, you see that the red is the combination of the yellow and the magenta. If you want a cooler pink, you just leave out the yellow and use magenta by itself. That's one of the major points of this video, is knowing the difference between how red and magenta behaves and the theory behind it, that magenta is the primary color and red is a combination of magenta and yellow. Hope that makes sense. A lot of people ask about how to mix hot pink, and I think what they mean by that is the most saturated, vivid pink that you could find. So I have this photograph of sunglasses. The link is in the description if you want to download it yourself and try to mix it. And that's a very vivid pink. I'll try and match this, and I think it will be mostly magenta. I'll start with magenta, and part of the issue here is it's so transparent, but I mean, that's pretty much color right there. So this background is mostly magenta. There's some variation, like it gets darker over here, so what would you add? Maybe some ultramarine blue. It's a little too dark. Now see, that goes purple, so what you could do is add a little bit of the Benz yellow. The yellow will neutralize that and just make it darker. So that's kind of too dark. That might be that color there. So that's about that shade right there. And if I just blend that in, I would imagine there's some point in the middle here where it'll be close to this color. So that right there is about the shade of that background color. I have a section in my color mixing course on how to mix black and how to neutralize colors, both of which are important skills to have as a painter. I cover the basics of color mixing and all the supplies that I use. The link is in the description below. Now, another thing people ask me about is like fluorescent pink, and there's no way that you can mix a fluorescent color from regular paints. You have to start with a fluorescent paint. Here's the kit of fluorescent colors from Liquitex. So that's fluorescent pink, fluorescent green, blue, yellow, and orange. So this is a very intense pink. You really can't pick it up on the video because the camera can only reproduce so many colors, and what happens is if the color is outside of the range that it can actually reproduce, it shrinks it down to a color that it can reproduce, and it looks a little bit duller on the camera than it does in person. What does this look like when you look at it under a black light? Let's take a look. The fluorescent colors look way more vivid, and it's actually like glowing, and you could really see it here in the tubes. These colors look totally dull and pale. You can barely tell what they are. And I've done fluorescent color matching videos where I match the color of like a fluorescent post-it note and some other items like that. I'll put a card up in the top right corner of the screen to the playlist. So the thing you have to keep in mind with like fluorescent colors is that if you add white to it, the glow in the dark effect diminishes pretty dramatically. Like you can see it's getting duller, and if I add more white, it's kind of cool. You can see the contamination in the white. And then if I add more white, it just gets less and less fluorescent. So one way that you kind of deal with that is you try to neutralize colors or lighten them by like adding this fluorescent yellow. It's kind of tricky. There is no fluorescent white really that I've found in paints. Here's what it looks like under normal lighting. That looks like a fairly vivid pink, and this looks incredibly vivid. These colors look very dull compared to the fluorescent colors. Now there's nothing you can add to regular paints to make them fluorescent. You have to just start with a fluorescent paint. So I use Liquitex fluorescent paints in my color matching videos where I match fluorescent objects. And Golden also makes fluorescent paints. You can check them out. I got a link in the description. The only drawback to fluorescent paints is that they're not light fast. Golden recommends that you can varnish over the top of it with a UV varnish, but the problem with that is that you'll lose the glow in the dark effect. I believe the reason for that is that the way fluorescent paints work is that it converts the UV part of the spectrum, which is invisible to the human eye, and it converts it into the visible part of the spectrum. That's why it looks like it's glowing. So essentially, I think that the regular fluorescent lights are basically a black light with a powder coating on the inside. And that powder coating is what converts the UV into the visible part of the spectrum. If you want to see a demonstration of that, I highly recommend the TV show The Secret Life of Machines. I'll link to it in my description. And they actually make a fluorescent light, which is really interesting to watch. Glazing versus adding white to lighten the color. Another way to make colors look more saturated is to use glazing techniques instead of adding white to it. And that's kind of how watercolor painting works, is that instead of adding white to your paint, you just add more water, and that makes it more transparent. And what happens is the light passes through the transparent layer of paint, and then it reflects off the paper and then back through the layer of paint. And that can create some very vivid and saturated effects. And you can do that same thing with oil painting and acrylic painting too. If you use transparent colors and if you use some sort of like glazing medium, you can use water in acrylics to make them more transparent, but I recommend using a gel or some sort of glazing medium because the gloss will also help to make it look more saturated. Matte colors kind of look a little bit duller. Like if you look at a car that's incredibly shiny, like a red sports car, the color looks saturated. Now think about if that was like a matte red, it wouldn't look as deep and as saturated. So this is gloss gel from Golden, and I'll just take a little bit of this, put it on my palette, and I'll add some of this magenta to it. So I'll add some of this to the paper. Maybe I'll add a little bit more of that magenta just to make it more vivid. Now that still looks pretty intense compared to like if I just wash out my brush here. Now if I were to add white to magenta to get that same pink, I don't know if you could see it on camera, but it looks a little bit more flat. That seems a little bit more saturated where it gets more magenta. Whereas if I start adding more magenta here, it doesn't really match that. I don't know if it really shows up on camera that well, but this seems more vivid than this magenta right here. And the only difference is this is transparent and this is achieved by adding white to it. Glazing is a fast process if you use acrylics because the gel medium will dry, within 10 minutes, maybe a little bit longer if it's humid. Oils take forever to dry. You could use some sort of quick dry medium or find some sort of glazing medium that maybe has some dryers in it to speed up the process. Have you ever had somebody recommend a color for like mixing pink and you try it and it doesn't work? So why is that? There's a couple explanations for that, and one of them is that different manufacturers use different pigments to make the same color. Alizarin crimson is a good example of that. The original alizarin crimson was actually fugitive, which means that it will eventually fade. So one way that manufacturers deal with fugitive pigments is they often come up with like a substitute recipe. So there's alizarin crimson hue, or they might call it alizarin crimson permanent. What they do is they find other pigments that are light fast and come up with a recipe that looks very similar to the original alizarin crimson. So I have an example of that. This is the alizarin crimson hue permanent. So it shouldn't fade in time, and it's made up of different colors. I have some of it on my palette and I'll mix it up. This is the alizarin crimson hue permanent, and I'll add white to it. This doesn't make a bright pink at all. I mean, that's kind of like a dark maroon color. It's rather dull. So somebody else will take alizarin crimson and they get a bright pink. Why does it work for them but not for me? Here are all the different alizarin crimsons that I looked at online, and you can see that they're all made up of different recipes. You can actually buy the real alizarin crimson from different brands. Graham offers it, so does Gamblin, and there's a few others. If you look at this, you'll see like the golden alizarin crimson has phthalo green in there. So if you add phthalo green to pink, that will definitely dull it down. And that explains why some brands of alizarin crimson will make a nice purple or a nice pink, and another brand doesn't. So I don't even use alizarin crimson, and the reason for that is if you look at this, a lot of them contain quinacridone magenta, some yellow, or maybe some other colors. So why not just use quinacridone magenta in your own yellow, and you can just have a limited palette and mix your own version of alizarin crimson. Here's another example of that issue is the swatches at the right are both quinacridone red. The one on the top is the one from Golden, and the one at the bottom is from Liquitex. And if you look at what the pigments are, one is quinacridone magenta and the other one is made from quinacridone red. So it's obvious that both of these are going to make different pinks, and you can see that to the right. The pigment codes are PB19, which is quinacridone magenta, and the other brands use PR209, which is quinacridone red. That's kind of interesting because that PB19 is also used by Winsor & Newton to make quinacridone magenta. So I know this is getting a little bit too technical, maybe it's a little bit confusing. What you really need to take away from this is just choose a brand that you want to stick with for a while and look at their color charts. From there, you can just like pick out a magenta and a red and try them out. Mix them with white, mix them with like a transparent medium, and see which ones you like the most. Once you figure this information out, you have that for the rest of your life. You can make tons of paintings with this knowledge that you gain from doing color swatches and just color mixing experiments. I hope that helps you to understand how to mix different shades of pink. The next video you want to watch is my one about how to mix purple. That will give you a complete picture of how important magenta is, so that video is up next.